Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This weekend, Boris Johnson has said he is all behind the Prime Minister after being accused of challenging her for the leadership and reopening rifts within the Conservative Party over Brexit. His tweet comes amid claims from two senior cabinet ministers that the Foreign Secretary has engaged in backseat driving over Brexit. On Saturday, Boris Johnson presented his vision for a bold, thriving Britain post-Brexit in a 4,000-word article in the Daily Telegraph. In the article, the Foreign Secretary opposes paying the EU to secure temporary access to the single market and revives Vote Leave's disputed referendum pledge of £350 million extra a week for the NHS after the UK leaves the EU. The intervention came just days before Prime Minister Theresa May is due to present her vision for Brexit in a speech in Florence on Friday. Yesterday, Home Secretary Amber Rudd accused the Foreign Secretary of being a backseat driver, insisting that Theresa May is managing the Brexit process and she is driving the car. Then Chair of the UK Statistics Authority, Sir David Norgrove, wrote to Boris Johnson saying he was disappointed about his use of the £350 million figure in his article, claiming it was misleading and a clear misuse of official figures. The Foreign Secretary then replied to Sir David, accusing him of willful distortion of how he had used the figure in his article. And on the Sunday Politics yesterday, Damien Green, First Secretary of State and close ally of Theresa May, spoke to Sarah Smith about the timing of the article and echoed Amber Rudd's comments in support of Theresa May's leadership.
As I say, I think that the timing is pretty second order in the big scheme of things. But to pick up from what Amber said, it is absolutely clear to everyone that the driver of the car in this instance is the Prime Minister, and it is the job of the rest of us in the cabinet to agree on a proposal or a set of proposals, because it's a complex negotiation, and then to get behind those proposals and get behind the Prime Minister.
Damien Green there. So was Boris Johnson right to repeat the £350 million claim? And was the government's top statistician right to challenge it? Well, let's speak to the Executive Director of the Royal Statistical Society. Lots of statisticians in this programme, Heaton Shah. Heaton Shah, should he have intervened, David Norgrove?
I think he was right to. So let's not forget that this figure has been floating around on the side of a bus and so on for quite a long time in our national consciousness, and the Stats Authority has intervened twice before, so this is actually a sort of progression rather than a completely new matter. And I think that in the specific case, the Foreign Secretary has responded and said that he was focusing on the amount that we would take control over, but it seems to me, even by his own test, the £350 million figure isn't the right one.
So is he just wrong about £350 million being available to take control of?
I would say so. So the claim is that we pay £350 million a week to the EU.
Although he didn't say that in this particular article.
Right. That's right. The claim on the bus was that, and then what his claim was that we would be able to take control of £350 million. It's worth remembering that the famous rebate that Margaret Thatcher secured, it changes from year to year, but this year it might be in the region of 100 million. So, and that money never leaves us. So it's hard to take back control of something that you've already got control over. So 250 million is probably a more accurate number. And so it does seem to me it was right to be challenged.
What do you say then in defence of David Norgrove when Boris Johnson accuses him of willful distortion?
Well, I'm concerned really to see the Foreign Secretary really undermining our independent statistical regulator in this way. As I say, it seems to me that there was a clear case for an intervention that, and this was the third intervention made on this particular figure. And, our system is the envy around the world in terms of the independence of statistics, and that, I think, is somewhat called into question by having the Foreign Secretary undermine the statistical regulator in this way.
Do you think, though, it is always potentially dangerous to motor onto political territory?
Numbers are always political, and it's a judgment call as to how that plays out. I think statisticians, the test that we must set ourselves is, are we helping to clarify the big debates of the day? It's not our job as the statistical community to tell you what the answer is, but the British public have a right to know what the real numbers are and to put them into context. And I think that is what the Statistics Authority was trying to do on this occasion.
So what do you say when Brexiteers will no doubt say you're on the side of Remainers?
Well, it seems to me that, you know, that's a pretty weak claim in this context, because the EU referendum has already been won by the Brexiteers. So now we're in a landscape where I think everybody is trying to make sense of the numbers so that we can have the best deal in the broadest sense possible for the UK. It's also worth remembering that the Statistics Authority has shown itself over the years as very capable of not just taking on the government at hand or the Conservative Party, but you know, it's certainly hassled the Labour Party both when it was in opposition and in government. So I think it has shown itself to come to these debates with clean hands.
Thank you very much for joining us. Lucy Fraser, do you believe Boris Johnson is fully behind Theresa May as Prime Minister?
I don't think what he did was a leadership bid. I do think he is a cabinet member, and do think he is behind the Prime Minister. I think we know that Boris Johnson is an independent thinker. He is enthusiastic and
not bound by collective responsibility.
Well, it's interesting that nothing that he actually said in that essay was dissimilar from what the Prime Minister had herself said in the Lancaster speech that she made.
Right, so why has he been accused of being a backseat driver?
Well, actually, I watched Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, on Andrew Marr, where that analogy first came about.
Damien Green said it, actually. In the clip we've just played, he said he's being a backseat driver.
He did. He was following on from the interview that Andrew Marr gave with the Home Secretary, where Andrew Marr put it to the Home Secretary, put the analogy to the Home Secretary, and it was the Home Secretary that picked up on the analogy, which then Damien Green picked up.
So you don't think he is being a backseat driver?
I think he is sharing his very clear views. He was one of the lead campaigners in the Brexit debate. He clearly feels very strongly about this issue. He clearly wanted to share his thoughts, and I think that's what he was doing. Right,
so why have we had it clarified for us by Cabinet members that Theresa May is the one in the driving seat because she is the Prime Minister?
I think that's right. I think the Prime Minister is leading the negotiation.
But why do they need to say it? We know she's the Prime Minister.
I think questions have been put to them, and so they have clarified that clearly she is the Prime Minister and she's leading the team, and we will have a very important speech. And I think what the British people want to know is what actually we're going to negotiate. We've got a very, very critical moment in our history, and we need to get the best deal from Europe. And I know what my constituents want is to ensure that the Prime Minister and her team are going to negotiate that deal for us in Europe.
They obviously felt they had to say it because she's in a weakened position, and perhaps in a stronger position she might have fired him. Do you think he should stay, Boris Johnson?
Well, the Prime Minister said that he will stay.
And what
she
do
makes
you
those
think?
Decisions, not me.
Right, but you have a view as a backbencher, don't you, about Boris Johnson, whether it's helpful to the Tory party?
I do think that it shows a degree of strength to keep people who are independent in your cabinet, to keep strong people in your cabinet. And so I think it does show that she's a strong leader, not a weak leader, by keeping him in.
So do you think actually this was a positive vision for Brexit that Boris Johnson was outlining? And the reason he felt he had to do it is because there's been something of a vacuum. There hasn't been very much from the Prime Minister since she made her Lancaster House speech.
I did think it was very positive, and I think it was very optimistic. And I do think we should treat the negotiation with optimism. I think I voted to remain, but I think we now have to get on with Brexit, and we need to look at this as an opportunity, not a challenge, to make sure that we make our mark and continue our place, which is a very strong place in the world.
Why not put him then at the forefront of the negotiations? You've said he's an independent thinker, he's not undermining the Prime Minister, he's painted this very positive vision. Why not put him at the forefront of the negotiations with Brussels?
Well, I imagine he is playing a role in Brussels. As I understood it, he was going to be standing by her as she made her speech. That was the intention. So I'm sure that she, as well as Liam Fox and David Davis, are all playing their part in the negotiation.
But he's not got a central role, we know that, and he has said to colleagues that he has felt marginalised by the negotiations. Should he have more control? Could he unlock the stalemate in Brussels?
Well, I'm sure that everyone is playing a part, and it's not for me to dictate how each player should play their part. I'm sure David Davis is taking a significant role. There's a lot of legislation.
Well, David Davis obviously is leading in terms of the negotiations, but what I'm saying as Foreign Secretary, do you think that he with his personality and independent thinking, could be the one to get a better deal with Michel Barnier?
I think that the Prime Minister should lead the negotiations as she is doing. I think she is going to set out her vision, and that is the position that the country should take.
And what do you want to hear her say?
I would like an optimistic vision of our place in Europe. I would like to see us maintaining a strong economy, a very, very close relationship with Europe on security, ensuring that we have an immigration strategy that works for us as a country. I think we heard loudly and clearly that people want us to take back control of our immigration and also of our laws. So I think those are important things that I'd like to see.
Do you think it's time the divorce settlement was sorted out and a broad figure was talked about?
So I think it's absolutely essential that we get on to the key aspects of the negotiation, which I've just outlined. You know, the economy, our trade deal, our immigration, all those things. And I hope that the negotiations about the divorce settlement don't hamper those negotiations.
Would it help to start talking about tens of billions of pounds that are going to have to be paid to the EU?
So as the timetable has been set out by the EU, we have to negotiate our divorce settlement first. And I think, therefore, we are going to have to start talking about figures, because we have to show that we've made significant progress on that in order to start talking about the things that matter to us all in the country.
Right, let's talk about Labour and Jeremy Corbyn, Catherine West. I mean, to some extent, he's done the dirty, hasn't he, on Leave voters who voted for Labour, because you're going to keep us in the single market, certainly for now and through the transition.
Well, I think what's being clear is the fact that if we want the economy to grow, and there have been lots of wobbles since last June, including the drop in the pound and the impact that's had on inflation and so on. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer have been very sensible in listening carefully to what needs to be done next.
Who are they listening to?
Well, listening carefully to both the TUC and the CBI. It's interesting when those two say the same thing, that clearly there has to be something in it, doesn't there?
But they've said that all the way through, to be honest. They haven't changed their position. The Labour Party's changed its position. Labour's changed its mind, hasn't it? Well,
of course, as somebody who thought that that was the correct position, I'm very pleased to see that it's coming. And I actually think
that they've changed their mind.
Well, yes, and I think that Keir Starmer, for example, in the way that he's made the arguments, sort of the opposite to Boris Johnson in a way, calm, cool, collected, watching very carefully as each phase of the negotiation comes up, what's the correct subject to enter here. And I think he would be doing a fabulous job if we were indeed in control ourselves and able to do that negotiation.
So you're happy that the Labour Party has broken a key manifesto promise?
Well, I'm very happy that both the Trade Union Congress and the CBI have been listened to, and indeed that, you know, the many, many union members who make up the TUC who have been saying, please look out for us, look out for our welfare. And the big employers like the NHS have said, just be very, very careful about what happens with this negotiation, because we want to address the 14% vacancy rate that we have with our nurses and doctors.
But as you say, Labour's changed its mind. You're very happy about that. Labour has broken its manifesto promise, saying well, because Labour clearly in the manifesto said they would want to see an end to freedom of movement, one of the 4 pillars of membership of the single market. So in other words, staying in the single market for transition, which is now Labour's position. Would you like to see that a permanent position?
Labour said that it wanted to see the exact same benefits of being in the single market and the customs union, and it's being pragmatic as to how we achieve that. And that includes this strong emphasis on the transition period so that business and employees are not affected negatively. On the immigration question, Labour wants to see a fair immigration policy. It will look very carefully at what the government proposes on immigration, which is yet to be unfolded.
But should freedom of movement end?
Freedom of movement,
as promised in the manifesto?
Freedom of movement will obviously be a part still of the position on the 2 years following March 2019.
Yeah.
And we will look very carefully at what the government has to offer on immigration, because
Right.
obviously there could well be policy differences.
So it might
We're
not end
very
at all.
keen- Well, what we want to see is some statistics and facts. As per your statistician earlier, we need to understand what's the impact of various positions on immigration before we change radically away from what we already have.
Just one final question, Lucy, on unity. Because Boris Johnson's speech, article ahead of Theresa May's speech said, "I am troubled with the thought that people are beginning to have genuinely split allegiances. Should Remainers feel unpatriotic?" I mean, he is saying that you have to believe and love Britain and you cannot love being a member of the EU too.
Well, you have to ask Boris Johnson what he means.
Well, what does he mean by that then?
I think I don't know what he means by it. I think it's very important that people have an identity either with Britain or with the world or with Europe. You know, we all identify with different things. I'm proud to be British. I voted Remain. I'm pleased we were part of the EU.
Right. Did you have a split allegiance then when you were proud to be part of the EU and proud to be British?
I think you'll have to ask Boris Johnson what he means by his statement.
Right. You don't understand what that means then, that sentence about people having split allegiances, which he thinks is troubling.
Well, I think he was talking about, he was concerned that people were putting the stars of the flag on their face.
And is that unpatriotic?
I don't think it's unpatriotic. So you can have several allegiances at the same time.
All right.
Well, more now on the hot water the Foreign Secretary finds herself in this morning. And the key question is, with her big Florence speech just days away, should Mrs May sack Boris Johnson for undermining her on Brexit? Or has he indeed undermined her? Joining me are the Conservative MP and Brexit supporter, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the Labour MP and one-time Remainer, Heidi Alexander. Welcome to you both. What do you reckon to Boris Johnson? Has he broken ranks to the extent that he should be disciplined?
Well, I think it is quite extraordinary, really, and I don't understand why Theresa May hasn't sacked him yet. I think that it seemed desperate to me to be resurrecting this figure of 350 million. It seems to me to be damaging to the interests of our country when we've got these negotiations going on. And I think ultimately this is more about Boris Johnson's ambitions to lead the Conservative Party than it is about his aspirations for our country. So I do think Theresa May should take quite strict action against him.
Sure.
What do you think?
I don't agree with any of that.
Why?
Well, clearly...
I mean, he is preempting the Prime Minister, isn't he, just a week before her big speech?
Well, I think the main thing is that, he's given a long essay. He stated out various positions. I don't think we don't know whether it's preempting because we don't actually know what the Prime Minister is going to say in the speech. If you actually look at what the Prime Minister said in her Lancaster House address in January, there isn't much, forgive me, in Boris's essay, which contradicts what the Prime Minister said in January. So I don't see any kind of division that people are suggesting is the case. And also, if you look at Damien Green's remarks yesterday, he said quite clearly that there was no real grounds at all for trying to sack Boris. I think the government is much more
unhelpful.
The government is much more united than the media.
He did use the word unhelpful, and when the Foreign Secretary is being unhelpful to the Prime Minister, you begin to wonder whether that's.
I don't actually remember him using that word. I mean, if you say he used that word, then perhaps he did, but I don't remember. I saw the interviews, and I thought that he gave a very good account of how unified the government was.
So where do you see the split, as it were, that Boris Johnson has broken ranks, or is he just marching in step?
Well, I think, if you listen to what Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, said on the Andrew Marr programme yesterday, she accused him of backseat driving. Now, it seems to me that he's not just backseat driving, he's trying to grab hold of the wheel, and my fear is that he is going to crash the car. One of the things he said in his Telegraph article was about pulling us out of the single market. I find this fascinating because Boris Johnson, before the referendum, was saying he would vote to stay in the single market, that he supports it. And so, for Kwasi to say that there isn't a split in the cabinet over this, I think it's patently obvious that there is.
Okay, so with regard to the single market, the one party that is very confused about their membership of the
I want to talk about Tory party. I'm not talking about Labour.
You know that.
Well, no, I don't know that.
But
let's be clear about this. We have now had David Davis and Philip Hammond saying there should be a transition period of up to 3 years in which they are open to the possibilities of things being pretty much the same as far as the single market is concerned. We now have the Foreign Secretary coming out and saying that transition period should only be 6 months and it shouldn't include consideration of that. That is a clear division.
Well, the main thing about the single market is that what the government has said, and the Prime Minister said in the Lancaster House speech in January, was that we should be prepared to leave both the single market and the customs union. Now, the position of the government...
So it's Philip Hammond and David Davis who should be fired.
The customs union and the single market, and the position hasn't really changed. Now, you mentioned the issue of a transitional agreement, and that's exactly the kind of thing that's going to be up for discussion. We don't know now what the end point may be. If our European partners say we don't want a transitional agreement, there won't be a transitional agreement. It's not in our power to have one or to conjure one up.
It is something that the Chancellor and the Brexit Secretary have proposed with the support of Mrs May.
They've mentioned it as part of the discussion. I mean, we can read that in the newspapers.
Yeah.
The actual position it has not been defined, because obviously that will be defined in the negotiation itself. So I think you're guilty of the preemption that you accuse me of. I don't think we have to wait.
Boris Johnson.
No, we have to wait and see exactly how the negotiation unravels.
We can't wait and see.
Of course we do. It's a two-way process.
We're 18 months away from the 30th of March 2019, when we could be out of the European Union. Businesses who are negotiating contracts with European counterparts at the moment need certainty. Why would you sign a contract to supply goods to a European company if you've got no idea whether there are going to be tariffs on those goods, and if the European company is saying to you, you have to take the risk on the tariffs? It's your financial exposure. It makes complete sense to have a transition period. As the EU has said, they are willing to have a transitional period for up to 3 years. I think Philip Hammond is right on this, that there should be a transitional period where you remain in the single market and you remain in the customs union. We have to give that certainty to businesses, and anything else is causing huge uncertainty in the economy. And I don't think we can put those jobs, that investment, the ease with which we trade, I don't think we should be putting that at risk.
I think you're right. I mean, but what I'm saying is that the actual
nature...
nature of the transitional agreement is not something that you or I or frankly any of the parties knows today. They don't know that because the negotiation, forgive me, hasn't happened. The negotiation is very much at the beginning. I think by March 2019, when we will have left the EU, according to the Article 50 provision, we will have a deal. I'm very confident of that.
Should your cabinet ministers still be disagreeing publicly on the way ahead when we've only got 18 months to go to this very big...
Okay, so everybody is agreed that we should leave the customs union and the single market at the end of a transitional process. Everyone in the government has agreed that. The Labour Party's different. And all we're discussing now is the length of a possible transitional agreement, and that's a very abstract conversation.
If the choice comes down to Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn for Prime Minister, who are you backing?
Oh, I'd back a Labour government every day.
Even with Jeremy Corbyn?
Over Boris Johnson, most definitely.
OK. And if it comes to a choice between Amber Rudd and Boris Johnson for next leader of the Tory party?
I think there are a lot of candidates. There are a lot of candidates. There isn't a vacancy. We don't even know when there'll be a contest. We don't know who the candidates are. They're both excellent. They're both excellent politicians.
Which one would you back?
They're both excellent politicians. I'd like to know what the full choice is, and even now there is no vacancy. So it's again a highly abstract hypothetical discussion.
Like you're an MP. Who would you go for, Amber Rudd or Boris Johnson?
Well, I like both of them. I think they'd both be excellent leaders.
One being a former Remainer, one being a Leaver.
Well, I think we've moved beyond that. As we've said, we're all committed in the Conservative
Party
you could vote for leaving the EU. I could vote for anyone I want. I mean, I haven't decided. I haven't even thought about it.
OK, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Now, Theresa May is on her way to Canada for trade talks. She leaves behind calls for her to sack Boris Johnson after his recent Brexit intervention. The Foreign Secretary has been accused of backseat driving and undermining the Prime Minister in a lengthy article setting out his Brexit plan. He also faces criticism by the head of the UK Statistics Authority, who's accused Mr Johnson of a clear misuse of government figures over NHS spending. Let's turn to Philip Blond, former advisor to David Cameron, director of the think tank Respublica, who joins us now, as you see. Philip, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
What's Boris up to?
Yes, it's difficult to discern, isn't it? But I think primarily it's psychological. I think he feels profoundly excluded by the debates that are going on. He has, by all accounts, been shut out of the speech that the Prime Minister is going to give this week in Florence. We anticipate that that speech will be about longer transitional measures, which include, paying in, as we currently do, to the EU. So I think it's a sense of a powerful politician being excluded from decisions at the centre and making a play back into the centre of the debate so that his agenda and his ideas are considered. I think that's the move, really.
Which makes sense, doesn't it? Because if anything, he would have expected after the general election and the result that he, far from being marginalised, he might have been valued more.
Well, yes, in one respect, and no in another. Look, let's deal with the plain facts. It's clear he's a leadership contender. It's clear the Prime Minister is in a weakened position. So it's better to have him on side rather than outside. It maintains the stability of the Conservative Party. I think that's what really governs the decision. And because Boris has the character he does, they can contain him and at the same time kind of not take him seriously. And also on another point, we've seen the Foreign Office itself lose power considerably over Brexit. Its powers have really gone to the Department for exiting the EU and to Number 10. So the coordinating role and the governance role, which the Foreign Office would usually take in such matters, is now gone from it. So the status of one of our great ministries of state, if you will, has really been marginalised. So I think that there was an institutional pressure, a psychological pressure, and I think Boris just wants to remind everybody he exists and he matters. Now, the question is has this worked out well for him or worked out badly?
Yeah, I mean, lest we forget, I mean, as well as a jobbing journalist, he's an historian, very interesting biography of Winston Churchill. He's a politician who will know there is a danger for him that the albatross around his neck, the £350 million a week claim, will be potentially the thing that people remember him for, not being a persuasive voice during the Brexit process, arguably the most persuasive voice, but that £350 million claim. And as things currently stand, that's it. That's the brackets after his name, isn't it?
Yes, and this is what I find inexplicable, because it's clear that the £350 million claim is a falsehood. It's an outright falsehood. It's a gross figure. It doesn't include our rebate, which is deducted at source. It doesn't also include the some 100 million figure that is spent in the UK on agriculture and universities and companies. So we know it's a fraudulent figure. So why deploy it? This is what I find inexplicable, and I think the chairman of the UK Statistical Authority did the right thing. I mean, politicians must be called to account when Western democracies, and I don't mean this to sound as hyperbolic as it does, but Western democracies really are being undermined by fake news, and it's imperative that our institutions maintain a yardstick and say, hold on, that's over the line. So I can't understand why he's sort of essentially recapitulating or arguing again for a figure that we know is a falsehood.
On the broader point that Boris Johnson makes, that we ought to be a bit more open to the idea that there's a potentially positive outcome, particularly economically, for Brexit. I mean, only this morning, CBR, respected think tank, says growth forecast for 2018 significantly higher than hitherto we'd thought. The Treasury talked about a Leave vote generating between 500,000 and 800,000 job losses just because of the vote. Instead, hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created. There is an argument, isn't there, that the positive story hasn't been spun enough.
I think that's right, and this is the upside of the article. And I think, Jacob Rees-Mogg also wrote that this is the romantic vision of Brexit that we need. And I think in this, both Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson are right. We don't have really a positive vision of Brexit. We haven't yet painted the future where we can all benefit in colours that we can all see and believe in. Our reasons for leaving the EU were mostly negative, and the gains aren't very clear. We could innovate in matters like pharmaceuticals and regulation, but then this gets us back to the detail. we can't, at the one hand, hold standards that are applicable in the EU, which the Foreign Secretary argues for, and then argue for new standards that will allow us to innovate. So I do agree we need a positive vision of Brexit if that's where we're going. And I do agree that it's part of the Foreign Secretary's job to paint that. But I think he's done so in really a way that has harmed him. He's used bad figures, and I'm being kind on that, and he's put forward contradictions in the same article and not explored them. So it further bolsters the idea that he can't command detail and therefore can't command the confidence of both his fellow politicians and perhaps even, his wider supporters in the country.
Philip Blond, thanks a lot.
Theresa May has tried to stamp her authority over the government and the Brexit process in particular, after a weekend of headlines about cabinet division centred around Boris Johnson. He was accused of backseat driving after setting out his vision for leaving the European Union. Speaking on her way to Canada, the Prime Minister insisted the government was being driven from the front. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
Military precision. Choreographed to the inch. The foreign visit, an escape from bumpy times at home. Before this tête-à-tête, the Prime Minister vowed she's in charge, driving from the front, whatever anyone else says.
Well, it's very good to be here. As I said to you as I came in, this is actually my first visit to Canada, but it's great that in my first visit I'm able to have meetings with you and to come here to the Parliament.
As it moves forward with Brexit, we're going to make sure that the relationship between Canada and the UK stays as strong as it always has been.
Theresa May didn't hide how her Foreign Secretary had left her less than amused.
The UK government is driven from the front, and we all have the same destination in our sights, and that is getting a good deal for Brexit with the European Union. That's a good trade deal, but also a good ongoing relationship in relation to other matters like security. And I've spoken in the past of the deep and special partnership that we want to build with the European Union.
And there he is, 400 miles away in New York, at the home of international diplomacy, the United Nations. Boris Johnson's rarely been afraid of controversy, branded by one of his opponents as a Poundland Donald Trump.
As for backseat driving, honestly, there's one driver in this car, to use Amber's metaphor, which he's quite often uses, and quite rightly. It's Theresa. People want to know where we're going, and I think that it's a good thing to have a bit of an opening drum roll about what this country can do.
And his rival, now it seems friend again, came to his defence. Michael Gove and Boris Johnson working closely together to help the Prime Minister with Brexit. But 5 days before her big speech on the EU, should that read trying to get their way over the Remainers in the Cabinet?
If I have any kind of advice, and it's not for me to advise them, but I just generally nudge in this direction, which is once Theresa May has set out where she wants us to be, I think it behoves all of us just to get behind that and say, now we have to achieve now. Of course, there'll be debates about how we achieve that, but let's just fix our head.
Labour claims it's chaos, not least because this man, Ollie Robbins, has walked away from his job as the boss of the Brexit department. He's not left just holding handbags, though. He'll still be the government's most senior official in the EU talks. But as the days count down to the Prime Minister's big EU speech he flashed in Downing Street, pressure's building on him, on the Tories and on Number 10. A government ministers are so keen to show is not a sinking ship.
Well, Theresa May will have been cheered by very warm words in Canada for the prospect of trade between our two countries after Brexit. But, this visit, George, was meant to be the start of a smooth progression, a build-up to a major moment on Brexit, and she's preparing to give that big speech on the future of our relationship in Italy, in Florence on Friday. Instead, Theresa May has been left again trying to prove she's in charge.
Laura, thank you very much.
This government is driven from the front, Theresa May insisted today, as she said that her cabinet was united over Brexit. On a visit to Canada, the Prime Minister was asked whether she was frustrated by Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson's latest intervention in the Brexit debate. Her response, Boris is Boris. The man himself was at the UN in New York today, where he claimed that his weekend newspaper article, 4,200 words, was just an opening drumroll for Theresa May's big Europe speech in Florence on Friday. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Just before arriving in Canada, Theresa May told journalists on her plane that government policy was being driven from the front. 5 days from her big speech on Europe, she's been upstaged by her Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, giving his vision of Brexit. Boris Johnson's already arrived at her next destination, the United Nations in New York. Theresa May was asked whether she agreed with cabinet ministers who said Boris Johnson was trying to be a backseat driver.
Look, the UK government is driven from the front, and we all have the same destination in our sights, and that is getting a good deal for Brexit.
Theresa May is in Canada to discuss a future trade deal with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Boris Johnson and many others who campaigned with him for Brexit hoped Canada's more distant relationship with the EU could be a kind of template for Britain after Brexit.
The trade relationship that we're excited about deepening, particularly...
Mr Johnson worries that since the election setback, some cabinet colleagues, like the Chancellor Philip Hammond, are dragging Theresa May to back a much closer relationship with the EU, and he wants to head that off.
You will get agitation about elements and then counter-agitation, but when it comes down to it, the deal we make is very clear in the sense that we are not in the customs union, we won't be in the single market, and we'll be taking back control of our borders, our laws and our money. Now that was what she said at Lancaster House.
And there was an election,
really
and there was an election in between, and some senior cabinet ministers think that has altered the dial on all of this.
Well,
and you've been watching it, you know what's going on.
Maybe some might think that, but I don't think that's the reality.
In Ottawa, Theresa May was asked if she backed the more decisive break from the EU or staying closer to EU rules.
I don't recognise the the simple binary approach that you have to the question of Brexit and the future relationship of the UK with the European Union post-Brexit. I've always said that we're not looking for to take a model off the shelf of a relationship that currently exists.
So it's not the number you've got on the side of the bus. This is a misleading bus.
Goes to Brussels. Totally right. Goes to Brussels a week.
Right.
Boris Johnson at the weekend also called for the government to implement the Vote Leave referendum pledge to give the NHS much of the disputed £350 million a week the campaign claimed would be available after Brexit. Theresa May indicated to journalists she wasn't about to do that. The man who masterminded the Vote Leave campaign, Dominic Cummings, here celebrating on the night of the referendum victory, believes the offer gelled living standard concerns with Brexit and actually won the referendum.
What are we doing? Taking back control!
Dominic Cummings has written, would we have won without 350 million NHS? All our research and the close result strongly suggests no. Hours after this victory speech, Dominic Cummings says he told Boris Johnson he'd have to announce an extra 100 million on day one of being Prime Minister. And Boris Johnson and Michael Gove strongly agreed. All are believed to have been in touch with each other before Boris Johnson wrote his article.
Some people think the Vote Leave band, like the Rolling Stones or something, looks like it's reforming. Is that what's happening?
I have no idea.
Take over.
I'm always astonished at how long the Rolling Stones can go on for.
What I'm trying to do is set out, in advance of the Prime Minister's speech in Florence on Friday, you know, because I was involved in that Brexit campaign quite a lot. People want to know where we're going, and I think that it's a good thing to have a bit of an opening drum roll about what this country can do.
Ollie Robbins, the most senior civil servant working for David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, has announced he's leaving that department. Mr Robbins will remain Britain's most senior official at the Brexit talks, but he'll work from Downing Street. He's seen here looking after the Prime Minister's handbag. One Whitehall source said Brexit Secretary David Davis felt Mr Robbins kept some work from him and didn't show proper respect. They will still have to work together, but not share a building.
Gary Gibbon reporting about. Joining me now are Henry Newman from the Eurosceptic think tank Open Europe and Labour MP Alison McGovern. She's a supporter of the Open Britain organisation, which campaigns for a softer Brexit. Or staying in.
Membership of the single market.
Membership of the single market. OK. So it's rather confusing, isn't it? So you're in favour of Brexit and you're called Open Europe, and you're in favour of staying in the single market and you're called Open Britain.
Well, actually, I'm...
appropriately confusing.
Well, I'm one of the Labour members of Parliament who have set up a campaign for Labour's policy to be staying in the single market.
Right.
Precisely because the confusion that's going on in the Conservative Party shows that they're just not capable of planning out a future for our country.
OK. Henry Newman, one has to admit it is a little bit confusing. You've got Theresa May saying we're driving from the front, which is kind of an obvious one, to be honest. You've got Boris Johnson being accused of being a backseat driver. I mean, I am personally feeling rather carsick.
Well, sorry for that. But I think overall, this shouldn't be too surprising that we're hearing Foreign Secretary making a Foreign Secretary speech. And this is all building up to the Prime Minister's speech this Friday in Florence. And that'll be the first major intervention from the Prime Minister on Brexit policy since the Article 50 letter and her Lancaster House speech, which is now 6 months ago. So I think, inevitably, there's a lot of speculation about what that will entail.
So you're buying this line from Boris Johnson today that it was just a drum roll for Theresa May's speech on Friday in Florence?
Clearly there are tensions inside the Cabinet. And Boris Johnson, as we understand from newspaper reports, was planning to give a foreign policy speech, and that speech was kiboshed for whatever reason or delayed, and Boris Johnson decided to go on the record with this article. But I think that the real question is, what sort of country does Britain want to be after Brexit? And I don't think we should be refighting the referendum. I think the referendum gave us a very clear answer on the single market and the customs union. So I'm disappointed that Alison and others are trying to reopen those questions.
That's just not right. There was no clear indication given. The Leave campaigners were talking about staying in the single market. And actually, the referendum was a snapshot on just on one day. And now we all have a duty to act in the national interest and make sure that we protect people's jobs and their rights and make sure that we have the kind of high-value manufacturing that we do well in this country, as well as all of those service industries that people work in. We've got to protect those industries.
But there's confusion on both sides, and we'll get to Labour's confusion in a minute. But first with the Tories, I mean, this was, let's face it, this was not a drum roll for Theresa May. This was a drum roll for Boris Johnson, you know, and his potential ambitions to take over from Theresa May.
I don't have a window into Boris's soul to understand exactly his motivations behind this intervention. But I think what the whole government is saying is actually that we're going to be out of the single market and out of the customs union. I think clearly there's a question mark over what sort of transition we have at the end of the Article 50 process. But the question I want to hear from the government, from the Foreign Secretary and from the Prime Minister, is where we're heading in the long term. Are we going to be just beyond a country like Switzerland or Norway, just outside the single market?
And we don't know that yet, despite the fact that the referendum took place more than a year ago.
Quite. Well, I think that's a fundamental question the country needs to decide.
And where we might agree is that we don't know where we're going, and that is extraordinarily problematic. Being outside the single market and outside the customs union has terrible consequences for my constituents.
But it's taken the Labour Party a year to decide whether you want to be in the single market and the customs union in a transition period, and we don't even know how long that transition should last.
It didn't take me a year.
Well, it took your leadership a year.
But the fact is, Keir Starmer has moved our position towards remaining in the single market and the customs union. He said we should have that for the transitional period, which should be an extended period of time to protect employment in our country. I would like us to go further and say that actually that ought to be the destination, that we ought to, even as we leave the European Union, remain part of the European family of trading nations, because that protects the jobs and the rights of my constituents.
But what is the point of staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, paying into EU coffers, but not having any voting rights? Then you might as well say, what was the point of Brexit in the first place?
Well, it is possible to still have influence. But in the Brexit vote, even those of my constituents who voted for leave did not vote to fundamentally change the terms of trade. Lots of them voted because of that promise for the NHS on the side of a bus. Some of them voted leave to get rid of David Cameron. We can't assume that because Boris Johnson says that leave means leaving the single market and the customs union, he's right.
Well, this is disingenuous. It wasn't just Boris Johnson. It was David Cameron, it was George Osborne, it was the leaders of the Remain campaign and the leaders of the Leave campaign were all extraordinarily clear about that.
Why do we only... That's not correct. Members of the Leave campaign said that we would stay in the single market, that we could stay in the single market.
Just one more. Isn't the problem here that the complexity, the ambiguity of this fundamental existential question is now inexorably tied up with the complexity of a leadership contest in the Tory party after this last disastrous election?
No, I don't think so. I think that there is a very important question to answer about the single market. And that question is, if we're inside the single market, as Alison would like, we would have no say over the regulations and rules that are coming from Brussels. We'd have no ability to change our position on migration. We'd have no ability to regain the sovereignty for which people voted on the 23rd of June last year.
Any trade deal that you do involves ceding some of your sovereignty. That is how you make a deal. And to describe any other position is completely disingenuous. But if we really wanted to do this properly, wouldn't we do it on a cross-party basis rather than this show that we're seeing from the Tory party?
Well, I'm quite happy with the cross-party basis.
Alison McGovern, Henry Newman, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
From a prime ministerial point of view, Boris Johnson might try the patience of a saint. At the weekend, he set out his vision of what Brexit should look like without bothering to consult Mrs May first. Inflammatory? You could say that. A sackable offence? Well, in normal circumstances, perhaps. But her position remains so precarious that these cannot be considered normal circumstances. He also baffled, to put it politely, some colleagues by trotting out once again that notorious claim that £350 million a week would be redirected to the NHS, one of the most discredited statistics in modern political history. Throw in the news that the top official was leaving the Brexit department but going to number 10, and it has seemed a rather chaotic and indeed confusing few days. Today, though, on a trip to Canada, the Prime Minister gave her response. Boris will be Boris, she said, insisting he was not a backseat driver. This government, she said, is driven from the front.
A Prime Minister getting away from it all, or maybe not, touching down in Canada for talks with its leader Justin Trudeau on forging closer links and especially a post-Brexit trade deal between our two countries. But when it comes to Brexit, she's pursued by the perception that her Foreign Secretary is disloyally trying to backseat drive her into a trading relationship with the EU that's a long way from being cabinet policy.
The UK government is driven from the front, and we all have the same destination in our sights, and that is getting a good deal for Brexit with the European Union. That's a good trade deal, but also a good ongoing relationship in relation to other matters like security. And I've spoken in the past of the deep and special partnership that we want to build with the European Union.
The government is split, with Boris Johnson leading one group who'd like the UK's future trading relationship with the EU to be like Canada's, involving no big payments to Brussels or role for the European Court of Justice. And there's another group led by the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, keener on replicating our current relationship with the single market. She seemingly favours neither.
Post-Brexit, I've always said that we're not looking for to take a model off the shelf of a relationship that currently exists, because of the position the UK is in. This is unique. We're already in the European Union, and so we have a relationship with the EU already. When we come out, we want to ensure that we can negotiate a good deal, a bespoke deal, a deal that is right for the United Kingdom.
The two blonde bombshells in New York ahead of the United Nations General Assembly, which Theresa May will be attending tomorrow. So, Boris Johnson, who is at the steering wheel?
As for backseat driving, honestly, there's one driver in this car, to use Amber's metaphor, which he's quite often uses, and quite rightly. It's Theresa. What I'm trying to do, look at the piece, what I'm trying to do is sketch out what I think is the incredibly exciting landscape of the destination ahead.
This official, Ollie Robbins, did a lot more than carry Theresa May's bag. He's been the UK's top Brexit official, the senior civil servant in David Davis's Brexit department, until today, when, after rumours that his relationship with Davis has broken down, he moved to Downing Street, where he'll work more closely with the PM, and still on Brexit. But of course, it's all going to plan.
The government's negotiation have been absolutely shambolic. It's disorganised, it's disunited, it's ill-prepared.
Unlike some of the leaders you welcome here, I can't match you on the socks.
No, that's quite horrible. Bants about Mr Trudeau's Argyle socks from May. So nice for her to spend time with a leading politician who has the gift of the gab, who doesn't want her job.
Thank you. And Robert joins us now from Ottawa. So, Robert, in an ideal world, do you think Theresa May would rather like to sack Boris or not?
she's never been a fan of Boris Johnson. She appointed him in the first place because she had to give something to the ultra-Brexit wing of her party, and she always assumed that, you know, he's so gaffe-prone that he would at some point fall on his own sword as a result of what we might call a cock-up. Now, many people do think that the personal Brexit manifesto that he published in Saturday's Telegraph was such a cock-up. But the problem is that it represents the clear view of an important number of MPs and an important wing of the Tory party, namely that the UK should not pay anything to the EU once we are properly out. And until she has settled in her own mind precisely what her policy is and all of that, he is unsackable.
OK, well, if that's the view of some important MPs, as you say, what about the party more broadly? What do they make of Boris's intervention at the weekend?
Well, they'll be in despair for precisely the reason that I've just mentioned, which is that what Boris Johnson has highlighted is that she, the government, is a million miles from having a thought-through destination for Brexit. The cabinet is completely split on this. We've got Boris Johnson, as I say, wanting to be firmly out of the single market, no role for the European Court of Justice in the future, no big payments to the EU. Philip Hammond on the other side wants to replicate, in essence, our current relationship with the single market. They both have religion about this, and the problem for her and the problem for the party is I don't see how she settles all of this while keeping the current members of the cabinet. So what I'm saying is, at some point, there will either be sackings or resignations, or indeed, if she can't hold it together, she herself will go.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed.
We are almost 6 months into the Brexit formalities now, and the Conservatives are being accused today of making an almighty mess of the process. For one thing, we had another huge personnel change this morning. The civil servant in charge of the Brexit department has been moved, a sign we still haven't settled on a way of operating. Then, on top of that, Conservative Party dynamics are complicating the process. The Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, marked out his vision of Brexit over the weekend and then slipped away to the UN in New York. Theresa May offered a trademark tautology in response today. Boris is Boris, she said. That was seen as a slapdown. Well, look, it's hard enough bargaining with Barnier and the EU without distracting arguments at home. But if there's a problem, the root of it is surely fundamental division on how Brexit should go. Theresa May is set to make a big Brexit speech on Friday, and right now it seems we stand at a crossroads, undecided as to which route to pursue. Every drama has its cast of main characters. Brexit is no exception. The most eye-catching plot thread is the political one, and the star is, of course, Boris Johnson. With not much role in Brexit, he tried to lead the debate this weekend with his own 4,000-word vision for how it might go. Today we got the official reaction from the Prime Minister on her visit to Canada.
The UK government is driven from the front, and we all have the same destination in our sights, and that is getting a good deal for Brexit with the European Union.
We also had the official Boris Johnson follow-up. Trying to look like a team player, he echoed the Prime Minister's language.
As for backseat driving, honestly, there's one driver in this car, to use Amber's metaphor, which he's quite often uses, and quite rightly. It's Theresa.
But there's another drama behind the scenes. Brexit has been led by the Prime Minister, Brexit Secretary David Davis, and also lesser-known civil servant Oliver Robbins, who's been running the department for exiting the EU. 3 is always a difficult number, and over summer it was said that David Davis didn't see eye to eye with Robbins, who was also reporting to Theresa May. Now, with the clock ticking, Robbins has left the department to a new job in the Cabinet Office, potentially strengthening Theresa May's grip on the process. The personnel and political dramas, though, are more symptoms than causes of problems. It's the divisions about Brexit within government that need to be resolved. One division is over the transition, how long it is and how much money should be paid over during it. Mr. Johnson who managed to squeeze in a meeting with Donald Trump today, wants it short and cheap, and was clear about that this afternoon.
The transition period, you know, I can see the vital importance of having clarity and certainty for business. I think what all of us agree, what the Prime Minister agrees, is it shouldn't be too long.
The other division is over the final destination for our new relationship with the EU. Should it be as close as possible to single market membership like, say, Switzerland, or an arm's length deal, more like the one Canada has with the European Union? Well, maybe the Prime Minister feels she can't be too explicit about Brexit for fear of losing some big chunk of her supporters in Parliament. But let's talk to Nick Watt, our political editor, who's in Brussels this evening. Nick, you've had a weekend to think about it. What do you think Boris was up to?
Well, shall I tell you what I think this is not about? It's not about an immediate leadership bid by Boris Johnson. One person familiar with his thinking said to me that the two serious candidates are Amber Rudd and Boris Johnson on different sides of the referendum, but they have one thing in common: not interested in the leadership until Brexit is out of the way. So what is this? It's a cry of frustration from Boris Johnson. He's been the butt of jokes from Downing Street. He feels that he's been sidelined, but what has really got him going is he believes what he regards as the negative Britain is a can't-do country, the negative attitude of the Remain campaign, he believes is infecting Whitehall, which is, and he wants to sort of, you know, put a bit of the Britain is a can-do country. And the reason why this matters is he believes that that negative attitude is polluting the preparations for the Prime Minister's speech in Florence on Friday. And what he wants to show is if you cede too much to Brussels, as he fears the Prime Minister might do, on the transition period, on a payment and on length, then they'll only come back and ask for more.
OK, Nick, but that raises an important question about this speech. Has Boris, with what he's doing, has that in any way kind of forced Theresa May's hand with that speech, constrained what she can say on Friday?
Well, I think that Boris Johnson is putting down a marker on the transition and the bill that you'd pay, but he's not putting down a veto. Boris Johnson has never said never to making a payment. Now, there's talk at senior levels in Whitehall that the divorce payment for Brexit would have to begin with a 4. It would be around about 40 to 45 billion pounds. And there are some people, not a million miles from Boris Johnson, saying, well, that's roughly the amount that we pay to borrow a year in the UK. And if you could get Brussels to break the logjam in the talks, come out of the straitjacket and get Brussels to talk now about the future trading relationship, then maybe it would be worth definitively leaving Brussels, definitively getting a future trading relationship. And if you have to pay the equivalent of a year's borrowing to do that, that to them is not a bad deal. And they will possibly be whispering into Boris Johnson's ear that maybe that's something he should think about.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. Well, with me now in the studio are the LBC presenter Ian Dale, something of a Conservative and Brexit supporter, Jenny Russell, who writes for The Times, I think not quite the same as Ian Dale on all those matters, and the former Conservative Minister, Dr Dan Poulter, who supported Boris Johnson in the leadership election last year. And I wonder if I can start with you, Dan. In a way, it's very odd, this, isn't it? Because a Foreign Secretary writes about international affairs in a newspaper. Why is there a fuss?
There shouldn't be a fuss, because what Boris has effectively said is largely what the Prime Minister outlined earlier in the year in her Lancaster House speech, which is looking at an optimistic vision for Brexit. I mean, I was a Remain supporter, but I think if you believe in democracy, I think we've got to accept the result of the referendum and now get on and make the best of the Brexit process. And he's talking about the opportunities that there are in that Brexit process, and that's got to be a role that he would perform as Foreign Secretary.
Right. So nothing to see, move along, except the odd bit in the Telegraph article, the Boris 4,000-word opus. Why is he giving an opinion on corporation tax reform, as he did in that piece, or on health spending and scientific research? That doesn't feel like the thing that a Foreign Secretary would normally do.
Well, he's outlined what the potential opportunities may be from Brexit, and he was one of the main voices of the Leave campaign, and part of that campaign, one of its mantras was taking back control. So he's talking about what opportunities there may be.
But sorry, was it government policy? Was his reform, his suggested reform of corporation tax, is that government policy? Had he spoken to Philip Hammond? Was he pre-announcing something the Chancellor was going to say? Or?
I mean, some of what he was saying was building upon existing government policy. Investment in the life sciences and in bioscience was a big theme of what he talked about, and that's a big opportunity linking with the health service. That's existing government policy and has been for a number of years.
Spending almost 350 million more on the NHS, that's not government policy. Had he cleared that with Philip Hammond?
What he said is that he believes that once we leave the European Union, there will be some money, some more money. Now, I think if we look at the figures, I mean, I don't think anyone accepts 350 million is the figure we'll be getting back, because I think the net return from leaving the European Union is more like 150 million. And if that money goes to the NHS, that's a good thing. So I think what he's doing is...
But that's not the Foreign Secretary's job, is it? He doesn't decide where the money goes.
But he's speaking aloud about what the opportunities may be from Brexit, building some of those ideas on existing government policy, as I said, in the life sciences, and also, you know, somebody who works in the public sector as well as being an MP. If we're talking about delivering more money to the public sector and the NHS, that's very welcome as far as I'm concerned.
You're making a really sterling effort here, Dan. It is obvious something is up. They are not agreed on what kind of Brexit we're going for. That is why Boris Johnson wrote the article. He wanted to put a marker down for his vision of Brexit. And we are paralysed by the fact that Theresa May is not strong enough to say, this is what we're doing, this is exactly what we're doing, this is how much we'll pay, this is the transitional arrangement we're having, because she's scared of the wings of her party, isn't it?
Well, no, I mean, Boris has said today that he backs Theresa May in leading the negotiations. All of us must back our Prime Minister in doing that. But at the same time, it's perfectly legitimate to talk about what some of the opportunities may be after Brexit. He's, after all, the Foreign Secretary. If a member of the government wants to talk about opportunities, wants to talk about what good opportunities are coming from Britain in the future, that's fine by me, and it should be fine by all of us, because it's about getting the best deal for Britain and looking at what that may be.
OK, well, stay with us and joining, because I'll turn to two journalists. Jenny Russell, is this basically Brexit chaos that the Tories have imposed on us? They got Article 50 going, and they weren't ready. I mean, you could argue.
You could argue, and you'd be right. Yes, this is. I mean, the whole reason that we're having this disastrous public row at the moment is that 16 months on from the referendum, the Cabinet hasn't had full discussions on what Brexit means. The meaning of Brexit is now locked away in Theresa May's head. We're all waiting for some kind of further unveiling of the plan in Florence on Friday. Boris is desperately trying to influence it. He's not been allowed to influence it from the inside because no one's talking to him. So he's coming out and attempting to shove a spike in Theresa May's back and push her in the direction of the kind of Brexit he wants from the outside. But the real problem here is that Britain still doesn't know what it wants. And we've got no sign that there's going to be any kind of discussion taking place that's going to allow that to become clear in the incredibly short time we've got left to make these decisions about trade and our future with the European Union. It's a catastrophe.
Well, Britain does know what it wants. You look at all of the polls and it shows that about 75% of the people, whether people voted Remain or Brexit, do want the government to get on with it. They've issued, I don't know where you've been for the last few months, Jenny, but they've issued 12 different papers explaining in quite a lot of detail, probably more than we expected, as to what their strategy is. Theresa May has made speech after speech. David Davis has made speech after speech. He's appeared in the House of Commons, God knows how many times. So I think we're quite clear where we're headed.
But OK, let me just quiz you a bit further, because some are saying the division is we should be in the EEA as close as we can get in without free movement. So that's EEA minus. The others are saying arm's length relationship, which is sometimes called CETA plus. That's the Canadian deal plus.
You're absolutely.
Now, which is it?
You are right, and there is clearly a cabinet split on this. I think that Boris's speech has shown that, where you've got Michael Gove and Boris Johnson in one area, you've got Theresa May and David Davis in another, and you've got Philip Hammond slightly sort of on the edge of them. You've got Sparks coming on later. You're doing an item on Sparks. They released a song a few years ago called When Do I Get to Sing My Way? You're probably wondering where this is going.
It's a brilliant linking.
Boris Johnson's speech was all about, hello, I'm still here, because he's been relatively silent on Brexit for the last year. And it was positioning himself, not for the leadership. I think Nick Watt was absolutely spot on that. but he wants to play a role in this, and so far he really hasn't. Now, I think it was incredibly ill-timed of him. I think to do that a week before the Prime Minister makes a Florence speech was appalling. To put that section in about the 350 million, he must have known. I mean, I know somebody who was in the Telegraph newsroom. Within 30 seconds, they knew that was their splash. Yeah. And he's not an idiot. He will have known that.
Jenny.
The difficulty with this is that Theresa May think that she knows where she wants Brexit to go, but she has no mandate for the hard Brexit, which she set out in January.
Brexit.
She then went...
No,
there are many, many different kinds of Brexit, as we know, which including being close to the single market and the customs union or not. And Theresa May went to the country and said, I want a mandate for a hard Brexit. The country refused to give it to her. And yet she appears to be proceeding down exactly the same path as if she hadn't failed to get a majority in that election. And the problem with this is that business is in a state of absolute panic about what this is going to do to the country, because almost half our trade is with the EU. And if we crash out without a deal, or if we go out in a hard Brexit, our living standards are going to plummet.
Should we worry about Oliver Robbins moving? Because in a way that seems like Theresa May. He's the civil servant running Dex EU. She's taking back control.
I think it's another example of just how little control Theresa May has. She set up this department and she put Ollie Robbins in this dual role, reporting to David Davis, with whom he did not get on.
That's not true. That is simply not true. I don't know where you've got that from, but I know for a fact
that's what I've got from people who work with them.
I got it from the horse's mouth. So the fact is, they brought in a second permanent secretary a few months ago because they'd planned this for a long time. He's still leading the negotiations. Can you really lead the negotiations, particularly if they become rolling negotiations, and also run a department? I don't think so.
Can I just say that one of the problems with this is that you're now going to have Ollie Robbins reporting directly to Theresa May. And he's supposed to be the practical principal negotiator, and yet David Davis is supposed to be in charge of the negotiations. If Ollie Robbins is no longer reporting to Davis, then it's very hard to see how Davis and Robbins can agree on what they're doing.
He's always reported to Theresa May and David Davis, and there hasn't been a slither of paper between the two of them in this whole time.
And now they have changed the reporting line because that wasn't working. It's part of the almighty model.
Do you ever think you guys have really screwed this up? I mean, it really is. Why invoke Article 50 if you don't know where it's going to take you? I mean, you know, we've lost 6 months. We're a quarter of the way through.
As I said, I campaigned for Remain. I believe that was the right thing to do, but the British people, by a majority, voted to leave.
But they didn't vote for a messy exit. They voted for maybe a clean Brexit,
I absolutely agree
but not messy.
that no government is going to be thanked if we don't protect jobs and put the economy first as a result of the decision to leave. And that's what we're going to have to do. So we will have to have some transitional deal in place. Now, what I think we've also got to recognise is that, you know, in the longer term, more of a flexible customs union arrangement with the EU would still put the EU in charge of negotiating Britain's relationship and trade deals with the wider world. Is that in the spirit of Brexit? I would say probably it's not. So we're going to have to come to some arrangement that has a transitional arrangement in place to protect jobs, put the economy first, but longer term move to a situation where Britain has a different relationship with the European Union, and hopefully we can still trade, but more on our terms.
We need to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.